Hi, I'm Emma, and I have the privilege of speaking to you today. I spoke a few weeks ago, and I'm speaking again much sooner than I first thought I would be. And as you can see, I have Jesus and his crew hanging out with us this morning. So you're welcome. And it's actually funny because I actually spoke to God as I was recording this to ask him to help me look into the eyes of Jesus when I do my recording, and lo and behold, there he is in the background. So it's got a good sense of humour when he chooses to answer in mysterious ways. I don't know how your week's been this week, but if it's been anything like mine, it has been one that has been very emotional and very up and down and a bit like a roller coaster, and I've had to do a lot of spiritual warfare to even get to this point, and I've had to do a lot of fighting for my mind. So if that's been like your week, then I can say I'm with you on that one, and if your week's been amazing and blessed, then hooray for you. I actually want to talk to you about a parable in Luke 15 that is quite well known, but a parable that God has kind of highlighted a specific verse to me, and a particular phrase that has stood out to me quite substantially. And that phrase has been something that I've kind of been mulling over and meditating on this whole time in preparation for this preach. And this week I've been drawn back to the nature of God and finding myself contemplating a lot on the way that he describes himself in his word, and kind of sort of ruminating on the fact that when we know who God is and his nature, then we know that nature wouldn't change the way that we see everything. And so in this story, it's kind of taken me back to locking onto this particular aspect of God that he's wanting to highlight today. So just as a quick synopsis, the story I want to look at is the story called The Lost Son, or sometimes it's called The Prodigal Son. And in this story, it's about a son who asks for his inheritance and then squanders his inheritance and in reckless living, and then ends up working in a field in the countryside, feeding pigs, and then kind of comes to his senses and decides to go home, and he prepares his speech in his head about what he wants to say to his father. And so the bit I want to pick up on is verse 20, actually, which is the kind of the crux of what this talk is all about. And in verse 20 it says, "But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and ran to him, threw his arms around him and kissed him." And the bit that was actually really integral in that verse, which I completely missed out, which is what the whole preach is about. So let's try that again when I can read it in a straight line. Is what it actually says. Let me read it properly. What it actually says is, "But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion." That's the key point. Was filled with compassion for him, and he ran to him, threw his arms around him and kissed him. While he was still a long way off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion. In this verse, we see a picture of a father who is looking for his son. I don't think it was just coincidental it happened to be one day that his father went out looking, and one day that his son decided to come back, and it happened to just work out perfectly. I think this is a story of a father who has been looking and looking and looking. And although this passage doesn't actually tell us exactly how much time passed between the son leaving and the son returning, what we do know is that this father was looking out to the horizon while his other son was out in the field and his servants were out working. This father was looking for his son constantly. And what we do get to see is actually the response of this father, that when he sees his son, he is filled with compassion. So much so that he runs to his son. So compassion is one of those words that has a very deep meaning, and we sometimes lose the interpretation in the English. And so I went back to the original Greek word, and I looked it up online, and I found the interpretation. The word compassion means for the bowels to yearn. It's quite quite a pictorial description, but that's what compassion means: for the bowels to yearn, for the gut to tear. It's a very deep, deep-seated emotion. In the King James Dictionary describes it as suffering with another, about a painful sympathy, a sense of sorrow generated by the distress or misfortunes of another. Compassion, it goes on to say, is a mixed passion compounded of love and sorrow. At least of some portion of that love is generally tending to the pain and the distress. And in the Latin, this word means to suffer with someone, and that their suffering actually becomes like your own suffering. That such is the identification and the sense of being able to connect with the other person, that it's like their suffering actually ends up becoming your own suffering, that you actually take on as if it's your own. And I used to view God's compassion more like his comfort, like a sense of affection and kindness, but actually God's been kind of aligning my understanding a bit more to seeing actually how he sees compassion. Actually, his compassion isn't just kindness and it isn't just empathy, but actually it's a fierce love that protects and that defends, and that I've heard it say God doesn't take it lightly when his kids get messed with, and that he will fight for his kids. Now I'm going to unashamedly steal some insight from another preach by a really great preacher called Katia Adams, and she talks about this very parable, and I think her talk is called The Lavish Father, and it really brings some incredible insight into the picture and the description of the father. And in this parable, she gives the insight about the context of the culture, of what this is set in, and I think that context would be a really great one to highlight some of the stuff that God wants to bring today. And so she shares about that in this Jewish culture, that the idea of running is something that is seen as shameful, and the fact that they would have long robes and they would have to pull up their long robes, which would have exposed their legs, which again would have just seen as something disgraceful or bringing like shame on themselves, and then to run would have just been seen as such a shameful thing. And yet this is what we see the father do publicly in front of every watching eye, that he will disregard his own honour to get to his son and protect his sons. And she shares this because this father chose to do this, because in the Jewish culture what the son had done to the father was unthinkable. Essentially, with the son asking for his inheritance prematurely was as if to say to his father, I disown you as a parent and I want nothing to do with you anymore, and you're dead to me. And so the idea that this son was going to return, and that if these local people had found this son, they would have most likely beat him or even killed him because of the level of shame and dishonour that he would have brought upon his family and the community. And so this father runs, not just because he loves his son, but because he also has this awareness of going, if I don't get to my son before these people do, they may not spare his life. And so he takes upon himself the shame, he disregards his own reputation, takes upon himself the shame and the dishonour to run so that he can spare his son of his son's shame and dishonour. And that's the kind of compassion that moves him, not just emotionally, but into action. It moved him, it caused him to run and to reach his son. But what I love in this passage is, which kind of God started to show me as I've been looking at it, is that not only does he run and takes on the shame, but then when he gets to his son, he lavishes affection upon his son publicly. And already what happens is the beginning of the reconciliation and the restoration process, but the restoration to the father's heart. The son doesn't even get to say a single word, but the father's already begun to restore and redeem his son personally and publicly, and restore the honour and dignity to his son. And in the next bit, we see the son is trying to do his speech, but he doesn't get to finish it. He doesn't get to complete his speech. He, much like Jesus, when Jesus reads out Isaiah 61 and omits the last line, the son doesn't get to say the last line of his speech. And there's a reason for that, I think. The father stops the son, or steps in before the son even gets to say anything about returning back to his father as anything less than his son. And the father stems that line from the son to stop his son from demeaning himself or lowering himself to anything less than a son. And immediately he calls for the robe and he calls for the ring to cover cover the son's disgrace, and to put the ring on his finger to signify that he is family and that he belongs and that he has an identity and that it is being re-established back to the right order. And the father is restoring dignity and honour and calling his son back to remembering who he really was. And it's something really fascinating to me, because the son, it's the son who thinks that he's less than the son. The father never sees that about the son. The father always saw the son as his son, and he never lost that place in his father's heart. And so the father's only ever interested in the son regaining the knowledge of who he always was. And of course, this is the picture that Jesus uses to describe our Father to us, that he runs to defend us and to restore us back to the right knowledge of who we are in him. And I don't know about you, but this journey of discovering that kind of love I've found hard and a long road. And I have found it when God has been trying to show me gently that I spend a lot of my time telling God how much I am not this and not that, and still not quite there yet about this. And God spends a lot of his time telling me about who I am and who he sees me to be. And it's something he kind of reminded me of, something he spoke to me a while ago, which was that it actually doesn't honour him when I spend my time telling him how much I fail in his eyes and how much I am not up to the standard. Actually, that doesn't actually honour him. And actually, it doesn't bring joy to his heart to watch me do that to myself. It doesn't actually bring joy or pleasure to his heart to watch me demean myself. And actually, there's this very gradual shifting that's God's trying to do in my heart and in my mind, or in my thinking, not so much my heart, but my thinking about myself, to change my understanding of how I see his nature and how he wants me to understand how I am truly loved. And actually that it actually grieves his heart when he watches me not fully be able to embrace all that he knows and desires for me to be. And it's kind of a beautiful echo in the song by Rita Springer called Defender, which she in this song talks about how God goes to fight our war before we've even known, or even before we've even asked, and he goes to win our victory for us, and that actually he picks up all our pieces and he restores us in his love that never lets us go and never lets us be anything less than he intended us to be, and that he will not let us settle for being less than a son, or less than his daughter, less than his child, and that his compassion moves him to take action on our behalf whenever we choose to settle or believe for things that are less than what he actually originally designed for us to be and have. And that's the kind of compassion that he has for us. And so this led me back to the part in Exodus 33, where God chooses to reveal himself to Moses at Moses' request. And in that moment, we see Moses ask God to show him his glory, and he does. But what fascinates me is, as I was thinking about this whole thing of the nature of God and the compassion of the Father, God says of himself, I will show my goodness to pass in front of you, and I will proclaim my name, the Lord, in your presence. But I will have mercy on whom I have mercy, and I will have compassion on whom I have compassion. And I think that's amazing. Like, it really took me aback when I read that again, of just, there's that moment where I thought, there are so many attributes of the nature of God, like his glory, his majesty, his holiness, his purity, his power, his sovereignty, his just and righteousness, his faithfulness. There's so many attributes about the nature and the heart of the Father that could have been like mentioned by God, and he chooses compassion. He chooses to identify himself with compassion, and I find that amazing, because it's not just somebody else's description of God. It's not just somebody else's wording of God. It's not just the Psalms saying that, or John in his revelation of heaven going, wow, look at the nature of God. It's God himself chooses the word compassion to identify himself as his nature. And the first thing he reveals about himself is that he's good. When he says, I'll let my goodness show itself before you. Like, that's the nature that he wants us to see first, that he is good. And that he is one who shows mercy and shows compassion. That he is one who has loving kindness and one who is moved deeply to take action on behalf of another. And it's something that I don't think we often stop and meditate about, that aspect of the nature of God. And so I kind of did. I stopped and I kind of had a moment of thinking, why do you do that, God? Why did you choose compassion out of all the many attributes that could have been? Why compassion? And so I asked him, and I stopped and I started to listen. And I started to write down actually what he said, and this is what I want to share with you. What I felt God say was this: the Lord is gracious and compassionate. This is how I want to be known, that there is no judgment, and I will run to my children to rescue them from harm. I search for them looking for one glimpse of their eye. I dote on them, and I celebrate every step they choose to return to me. I want to read that again. The Lord is gracious and compassionate. This is how I want to be known, that there is no judgment, and I will run to my children to rescue them from harm. I search for them, looking for one glimpse of their eye. I dote on them, and I celebrate every return step to me. When I first started to write those things down, that really moved me. It really did something inside of me of just, I'd never really felt that kind of heart of God quite like that, in him speaking so clearly to me about how he sees himself and why he chose that to be his characteristic, to reveal his nature, rather than all the other things that we would naturally choose to describe God with. That he chose goodness, mercy, and compassion. I wonder how much time we spend thinking of God as one who yearns for us, who counts our suffering as his own, that when our hearts break, his heart breaks, and that, like the a writer of Hebrews says, that Jesus is not one who can't sympathise with us, but actually he can sympathise because he's been human, he's been tempted like us in every way, and he can identify with all of the things that we go through in life: heartbreak, heartache, disappointments, pain, upset, confusion, even betrayal of friends. All of it he's experienced, and he can empathise, but he can also do something on our behalf, because he can go and fight and defend for us where we can't. So I would want to encourage you this week that maybe to take some time, even today, just to drink in, to meditate, to contemplate on this nature of the Father that he chose of himself to reveal about himself. That his words are that he is merciful and compassionate, and that he and to let that fill you deep within, and to bring a sense of wonder and peace that he's the one who loves you, who defends you, who is moved into action on your behalf, and who fights for you, and who is determined and committed to restoring dignity and honour to you. I hope this blesses you, and I hope that you have a great week, and that you know his kindness and his compassionate heart for you. And we'll see you soon. Take care.